Hello and welcome back to another update as we cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. We start out here in the south in the direction of Robotyne, where the Russians have managed to make an advancement here to the southeast of the village. Taking a look at the map with the fortifications, we see that the Ukrainians have two layers of fortifications here right next to Russian positions, and the Russians are being shelled by FPV drones as they try to advance in this section, as is shown with this geolocated footage. Based on this footage, we can see that the Russians are attacking these fortifications, and yet again, if we take a closer look, these fortifications are connected to these forest areas, and the Russians are advancing towards them from behind the forest lines, allowing them to have the cover of the forest itself when advancing towards these fortifications, which makes these fortifications weaker for the Ukrainians than what they would be for the Russians, as the Russians would have a much greater area of vision, field of vision, that the Ukrainians would have with these forest lines. So we are seeing that the Russians are trying to push through these fortifications by going through the forest lines and capturing them, which would allow them to gain control over a large area to the north of these positions due to the field of vision being extended and them holding advanced fortifications in the section of the front line. At the same time, we're seeing that there is this fortification here to the south of these positions, which is an additional line. And again, it is in a section where it would be looking in a northern direction rather than a southern direction. So with the Russians gain control over these fortifications, they'll likely launch assaults towards that one as well to gain control of that, which would allow the Russians to then hold control over this section of the front line right here, as they would have fortifications that are prepared in this direction overlooking this whole area. And by that point, the Russians would be able to attack Robotyne from the east as well. However, getting a closer look at these fortifications, we see that they are in a much better position for the Ukrainians than these other positions and fortifications to the east. And with them, the Ukrainians would be able to hold on to the village firmly from the east as well. So we're likely going to see, if the Russians re-enter Robotyne, for them to be pushing from the western side and try to gain control over the fortifications to the north of the village before moving on to them through the village itself and bypassing the fortifications to the south, as they tried attacking from the southern direction and northern direction. However, that is a wide front to pass through to get to the fortifications in the north, which is why the Russians failed to gain control of the village, because they simply had nowhere to gain a foothold within the southern parts, as the village itself is completely destroyed, meaning that the only positions really within the village are the ones here to the east and to the north, as well as the south of the village. They had control over the southern parts, but failed to gain control over the eastern or northern parts, and were subsequently pushed out. With these developments, we see that the Russians are looking to gain better control over the flanks before attacking the village itself, as that would allow them to gain a position here to the east as well, which would cut off the Ukrainian positions to the south, forcing them to either withdraw or counterattack the Russian positions, which would then subsequently allow the Russians to push in a northern direction towards these fortifications from multiple directions. At the same time, we see that there are these fortifications to the northeast of the village, and yet again, there are forest lines to the south of them, which means that it is difficult for the Ukrainians to gain field of vision in the southern direction, and this one is simply too far away from the positions here by Robotyne, which means that the only ones to really take point of, if in the Battle of Robotyne, is the ones here to the north and east of the village. Moving on to the next section of the front line, we see here in the direction of Novomikhailivka, there were further advances by the Russians, as they managed to capture the final parts here to the south of the town, and they managed to reach the town center here in the central parts, as is shown with this geolocated footage. Based on this, we see that the Russians have made an advancement further within the central parts, and they now have a significant foothold within the town, gaining control over a major part of it, and the Russians are now looking to gain the final part of control here in the northern parts to match the town to the center and cut it into 50-50% holding on each side. There's the dash area to the north as well. In this scenario, it is likely that the Russians will look to start pushing in the northern parts, whether it's through the road or through the forest areas. But based on this, we see that they will likely go in here in the southern direction, or simply move in the northern direction to connect with them at the same time to gain the 50% control, after which it will proceed in a western direction and likely fighting towards the Dacha area as well, as the Russians would look to capture it and prevent the Ukrainians from getting a foothold there connected with Pereskovivka. The fighting here continues heavily, and there's a lot of artillery on both sides, as the Ukrainians are prioritizing this as one of the areas in which they are willing to give it their all to hold. What we're seeing from the Ukrainian side is that they are really putting a lot of effort into holding the current areas, and that of course takes a lot of artillery and takes a lot of personnel and force them to commit the majority of the army to the front line, which means that if the grinding continues, if the fighting continues, especially with the rate at which the Russians are dropping FAB bombs right now, over 100 a day throughout the front line, the Ukrainian army will be grinded down much quicker than if they had withdrawn to better fortified positions. But this is what is happening right now, and we see in the direction of Rehorivka, there was yet another advance by the Russians, and now they've reached the central parts of the village, and with this there are further advances westwards from Marinka. In the northern direction towards Krasnohorivka, the Russians have gained or expanded their foothold here to the south of the city and advanced here to the east by the railway and fortifications here. With this, the Russians are looking to pretty much add up or gain control over the railways moving into Krasnohorivka, allowing them to gain additional supply routes in and out of the city to expand their control and fight within it. However, as we can see with the fortifications, we can see that the Ukrainians have heavily fortified the eastern parts, which makes it difficult for the Russians to push through here by the railways, and this is why their advances were limited to just this part. They've now reached the fortifications the Ukrainians have here by the railways, and will have to push through that and capture it if they want to reach the city itself. We then move further north here in the direction of Berdishi, where there is this geolocated footage showing an additional Abrams tank being destroyed. This is the third Abrams tank, as well as a Bradley IFV. With this, we see that the Ukrainians continue their counterattacks here in the direction of Berdishi, managed to reach the eastern parts, but on the northern side of the village, and they're trying to push the Russians completely out of the village. Every time they push a bit, they lose another Abrams, and at this point they've lost 3 with geolocated footage. We're seeing that the Russians are continuously trying to hold on to it and are likely counterattacking. The tank was hit by a ATGM missile, so that is why it was disabled. But with this, we see that the Russians have positions here in the forest area and are protecting the northern flank of Berdishi with these positions, and will likely re-enter and regain these positions that were lost to prevent the Ukrainians from pushing them out of the village. Gaining a foothold in the village took a long time for the Russians, so the Ukrainians pushing them out with these counterattacks with the Abrams tanks is a development that the Russians are trying to avoid. We're currently seeing that the majority of the fighting taking place here within these 3 villages is in Berdishi, as the Ukrainians are trying to recapture these positions. But other than that, there is some positional fighting in Orlivka and Tonenka, where the Russians are trying to gain full control over Tonenka, and the Ukrainians are trying to get a foothold within Orlivka. Moving further north here in the direction of Ivanivsky, there was yet another advance by the Russians here in the central parts of the village. We're seeing here that the fighting in Ivanivsky is largely positional, as Russians are making some small advancements bit by bit over the past few days, but they have made an advancement every single day since the first days of March. And with this, we see that there is continuous attempts by the Russians to slowly capture the village of Ivanivsky. We're seeing that with these small advancements, they're taking control of one street after another, and now they reach the central parts where they've captured the majority of the village, over 50%, and now they're moving to this western part right here through the central parts, and fighting also takes place here in the northern parts by the road, which is connected to some of the fortifications the Ukrainians have in the north. Moving further north, we also see advancements by the Russians here in Bohdanivka, where they've managed to advance within the central parts of the village, and we see with this the restart of operations by the Russians in Bohdanivka. With this, we see that there is an attempt by the Russians to push through towards the canal line. Restarting these operations here are likely due to the success in Ivanivsky, where they're looking to do both at the same time, which would force the Ukrainians to either withdraw from these positions in the central parts or to resupply them, which would be under close proximity to Russian positions if they manage to gain a control over the forest lines and forest patches here to the south and north of Chasiv Yar. So the Russians are looking to develop the situation where they can bypass the Ukrainian fortifications rather than fight through them, as they are heavily fortified areas here to the east of Chasiv Yar. Moving further north here in the direction of Sinkivka, there has been significant developments here as well. The Russians have withdrawn from the northern parts of the village back into the forest areas due to the positional fighting seeing no end. The village here is also largely destroyed. There are still a few footholds to be gained, but the positional fighting is largely reliant on FPV drones and artillery, and for that the Russians don't really need to be within the village. Instead, what we're seeing is that they were pushing here in the east, gain control over half of this forest line here to the east of Sinkivka. They'll likely look to gain control over the road here to the east of the village before moving on to the artillery-based positional fighting, preventing resupply into Sinkivka from the east and focusing on the forest areas here to the west of Sinkivka. If the Russians are looking to gain control over Sinkivka, they need to gain control over the forest areas and prevent the Ukrainians from resupplying the village instead of pushing through it, which will put them in a vulnerable situation, as Ukrainians have a lot of FPV drones to use, and that hits the Russian infantry in the area. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.